Thank you and welcome to day one of the Geography Graduate Student Associations, or GGSA, Climate Talks, entitled Indigenous Wisdom and Perspectives on Colonial and Industrial-Induced Climate Change. Again, this is an event sponsored by SDSU's Student Success Fee Grant. And we just want to thank all of you for taking your time to join this Zoom event. We think this is a special and necessary discussion that will really challenge how we think and approach climate topics about climate science and climate change. So while attendees are logging in, we want to kind of direct your attention to our main webpage with more information about the talk, about our moderators, and about our panelists. So we're sharing a link also to our first climate talk from last year, which focused on bringing together scientists, educators, and activists to discuss a variety of climate topics. And also GGSA's email, in case you have any further questions or comments for us. So we will go ahead and share the links and the email in the chat. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Corey Monteverde. I am a PhD student in the Department of Geography at SDSU. And I also have my co-host here, Selena Ibarra, who will be monitoring the chat and kind of documenting all of your questions as they come up. And we have planned 3 days of panel discussions with a purpose to first provide a forum for Indigenous insights, concerns, and lessons to challenge blind spots, errors, and exclusions of Western climate science. And second, to present SDSU students, faculty, staff, alumni, and the wider public with opportunities to become worthy to responding to these challenges. We are recording these events and we will share them on a web-based application and through our follow-up newsletter. So this will allow for conversations to happen and to form even after this event ends. So the structure of today's discussion will begin with a land acknowledgement statement, and then each panelist will share their perspectives, practices, and wisdom, and the associated challenges Indigenous communities may be facing related to colonial and industrial-induced climate change. So we will then open a discussion between the panelists led by the moderators, and then we will open for a Q&A session with the audience. So make sure to type your questions and comments in the chat at any time. You don't have to wait until the end to post a question. If you hear something during the talk and you'd like to ask about it, go ahead and type it in. Selena will make sure to kind of document those as the time goes on. So now I'm very honored to introduce our moderators and our panelists. So our moderators are Shasta Gaughen and Giorgio Curti. Shasta is the Environmental Director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Paula Band of Mission Indians and has worked there since 2005, where she established Paula's Tribal Historic Preservation Office. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico, has worked as an adjunct professor at CSU San Marcos, is the chair of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, is a member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, secretary of the board for the Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, a lead of the Tribal Working Group for the Climate Science Alliance, and a member of the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals Climate Change Advisory Committee. So we're very grateful to have you as a moderator, Shasta. I know last year we invited you as a panelist, so it's really nice to have you moderate these next 3 days. So thank you.
Thanks, Corey. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, we are too. And then we have Giorgio Curti. Giorgio is a socio-cultural geographer and critical ethnographer who works at the intersections of cultural and natural resources laws, traditional and local knowledges and sciences, and the collaborative development and implementation of land and water stewardship and management strategies guided and defined by Indigenous and traditional communities and associated human-environment relationships and worldview and value systems. He received his PhD from SDSU and UCSB and founded the Cultural Geographic Consulting in 2016. He also serves as an adjunct professor at SDSU and is a researcher with the Young People's Environment, Society, and Space Research Center. So thank you, Giorgio, for helping to put these talks on and putting in a lot of time and effort into these. We're really grateful for you and moderating a second year now. So thank you so much. And then we are also joined by our amazing panelists, Edward Wemytewa and Valentino Villaluz. And I know that they'll each expand on their backgrounds, but we want to welcome Edward and Valentino. Edward is an artist and tradition bearer for biocultural diversity who founded the Children of Middle Earth Theater in 1995, where his art focuses on issues facing the Zuni people. So Edward, thank you so much for taking your time to be here with us tonight. And then we also have Valentino, who is a wildlife program manager for the Swinomish Indian tribal community. He is a lifelong practitioner of nature-based worship and is a first foods provider for his community. So thank you, Valentino, for joining us tonight. So to begin, we want to open with a land acknowledgement statement and frame the purpose of these discussions. So we as students have asked Giorgio to lead us in these opening statements, and we wanted to create a narrative for these talks about climate science and change and how we can become worthy of understanding the challenges of these discussions today. And Giorgio works closely on these topics, and he was willing to help frame the climate talks for us. And we also want to clarify that GGSA did reach out to the Kumeyaay community, but because of the timing and the structure of the talks, unfortunately, none were able to take part. So with that, I'll give the floor to Giorgio, and then I'll let Shasta and Giorgio take over the rest of the discussions for today. So Giorgio.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Edward and Tino, for contributing today. I know everybody who's taking part is going to be enriched with your perspectives and your experiences and your wisdom. What I'm providing here is a land acknowledgement, but also more than a land acknowledgement, like Corey said, to provide sort of context. And I will turn it over to Edward, and then we'll turn it over to Tino as it progresses. So I don't want to take very much time, but this was a request by the students to sort of provide this context. So I'm going to read, so I apologize. I'll be staring at the screen oddly for about the next 5 minutes. Since time immemorial, the Kumeyaay people, Ipai to the north, Tipai to the south, Kamia to the inland, and all of those who have used and continue to use the self-identifier Gaughen, whether by active choice or colonial imposition, have been part of the lands and waters we often call today San Diego County. These lands and waters have nourished, healed, protected, and been intimate and indelible parts of the familial and social of Kumeyaay for many, many generations, and continue to be today. With, in, of, and through these lands and waters, Kumeyaay have practiced familial and social relationships of stewardship, care, balance, and harmony. Relational practices that live and support life always for the people. What I have been taught by the Kumeyaay people with and for whom I work is that the depth and weight of what it means for an act, a thought, a song, a prayer, a method, an offering, an action, a practice to be for the people can only truly be glimpsed and loosely grasped when notions of the person and concepts of the social are opened up to relations and capacities that exist far before and far beyond dominant and dominating human-centric errors and blinders. As members of the San Diego State University community and residents of the city and county of San Diego, it's imperative that those of us who are not indigenous to these lands and waters recognize that we are contributing to a colonial settler institution, that we are ourselves settlers in indigenous Kumeyaay lands, and that more often than not, we're directly implicated in promulgating, promoting, and perpetuating these dominant and dominating errors and blinders, whether passively or actively. We must both acknowledge this legacy and ongoing presence of coloniality and take ownership of the fact that each one of us has a deep obligation and weighted responsibility to actively and productively work towards restorative, geographical, historical, political, cognitive, legal, and social justice within for Kumeyaay people, wherever, whenever, and however they deem appropriate. It is thus essential that the language of land acknowledgements not be confused for the production of spaces for equitable and corrective action, or those of representational recognition mistaken for productive systemic change. If acknowledgements are to be meaningful, they must be continually generative. Therefore, so too must they be accompanied by actionable institutional respect and operational structural inclusion in perspective, policy, practice, and return of the knowledge and political sovereignty of Kumeyaay people, and indeed all Native peoples, to all ancestral and familial lands and waters. On January 20th, 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 13985 on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. In response, Pueblo Abzuni Governor Valentino stated in a letter to the Biden-Harris administration and Office of Management and Budget on July 1st, 2021, quote, "All lands and waters within and intersecting the borders and boundaries of the United States are native lands and waters. This basic fact must first formally be addressed, officially recognized, operationally accounted for, and serve as the basis of any honest and sincere effort at advancing equity and support for the underserved Ashiwi community and Pueblo Abzuni, and indeed all Native American tribes and communities." Recalling your own recent words this past June, Mr. President, great nations don't ignore their most painful moments. They don't ignore those moments of the past. They embrace them. Great nations don't walk away. We come to terms with the mistakes we made. End quote. These mistakes of colonial settler nations are as deep as they are enduring, and as prevalent as they are dispossessing and alienating, globally and locally, yesterday and today. As Potawatomi scholar Kyle White has explained, colonial and industrial-induced climate change is in fact just one intensive manifestation of environmental change born of colonial settler societies. Quoting Professor White, "Thinking about climate injustice against Indigenous peoples is less about envisioning a new future and more like the experience of deja vu. This is because climate injustice is part of a cyclical history situated within the larger struggle of anthropogenic environmental change catalyzed by colonialism, industrialism, and capitalism, not three unfortunately converging courses of history." End quote. Flowing through the heart and enveloping the mind of colonial, industrial, and capitalistic actors and their values, perspectives, choices, politics, and practices driving climate change are what anthropologist Gregory Bateson identified almost exactly 50 years ago as epistemological errors of dominant and dominating Western systems of logic and value. Quoting Bateson, "The last 100 years have demonstrated empirically that if an organism or aggregate of organisms sets to work with a focus on its own survival and thinks that that is the way to select its adaptive moves, its quote unquote progress ends up with a destroyed environment. If the organism ends up destroying its environment, it has in fact destroyed itself. And such epistemological error is all right. It's fine, up to the point at which you create around yourself a universe in which that error becomes imminent in monstrous changes of the universe that you have created and now try to live in." End quote. These epistemological errors inform and guide not only how we frame the possible futures that climate change may or may not bring, but limit what might be included of various pasts. Matthews and Barnes cover this topic in their introduction to an important special issue of the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. They note, quote, "Just as states have sought to manipulate the past by celebrating some moments in history and silencing others, so too they have linked these selected pasts to particular futures. The question of the past then, if looked at in the right way, has always also been a question about the future. The future can be told as a story, calculated as a probability, or speculated upon as a form of potentially valuable risk. The future is not one but many, and those who create futures typically seek to narrow down what the future can be to a relatively limited subset of possible registers." End quote. "I have been taught by Kumeyaay and Ashiwi, Atahum and Dene, Ko Salish and Chalat, Lakotas and Dakotas, that to truly acknowledge Indigenous lands and waters is also to always recognize, honor, and respect both the futures and pasts of non-human and more than human relations that have existed from the times of the beginning or the beginning with no beginning. These are the relationships of the air and the winds, the mists and the clouds, the soils and the minerals, the animals and the plants, the stars and the constellations, what is below and what is above. This is the life of land and water. This is the capacitational life that colonial and industrial-induced climate change monstrously effaces and eviscerates. When promulgating, promoting, and perpetuating these errors driving climate change, our institutions become perverse. And when enabling these institutional and structural monstrosities, whether passively or actively, we ourselves become monstrous. The lesson then, if we're to become worthy to the challenges of these climate talks, is to begin to come to know how, from the deep time and deep space knowledges and wisdoms that formed and grew together with the lands and waters of what we often call today the United States of America, and which will be graciously shared with us over the next 3 days. It's to start to find pathways and build circuits for correctives to the epistemological errors driving our dominant modes of knowledge production, of pasts and futures, scientific, philosophical, economic, and otherwise, to become less monstrous in thought and action. You, the audience, are the future climate scientists. There are many more possibilities for inclusive, productive, balanced, collective, and generative past and futures out there for the people than what your algorithms, models, and projections commonly tell. Thank you. Now I think, Edward, the space is open to you, and then we'll follow with Tino.
Thank you. It's amazing that you touched upon a couple of things that I will be talking about as well. So, we're on the same plane. Again, thank you to San Diego State University for hosting this forum. Again, we really appreciate this, and thank you. Before I get into my presentation, I want to acknowledge Kanahu's manual. Her project is called the Little House Project, and they're sequempemic out in British Columbia, Canada. They're water protectors, and it's women-led, and they're strong. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge Kanahu's manual and her family. I also want to acknowledge our clan mother and our clan brother who are in this room with me. They have been very incredible supporters of my work. They roll up their sleeves and they're out there working with me as well. And I just want to make sure that I acknowledge them because they're very critical, not only for us as Zuni people, but in a greater sense. I'd like to also open with a thought for my presentation. The thought is embedded in today's collective human knowledge. We know there is no planet in our solar system where there is water other than our planet Earth. Better yet, there is no planet beyond our solar system that has quantifiable water, period. Only Earth has the rare element, water. Therefore, water is sacred, just as is Earth Mother. Mini wichoni, agua is vida, water is life. I want to leave you with that thought. We'll come back to it again. There is a Zuni prophecy written in a book entitled The Zuni Self-Portrayals. It was published in 1972 by Alvina Kwong. The prophecy in that book is called Prophecies of Our Grandparents. Drinkers of dark liquids will come. I heard the prophecy in its many interpretations early in my life. One part never made sense until now. It is the part that says, then our possessions will turn into beasts and devour us whole. It makes sense now because the prophecy unfolds as we speak. The other gauge has been the prophecy called riding on the tailbone of the deer, which talks about when brothers start killing brothers, implying that our culture is riding on edge, about to fall off into the abyss. 20 years ago, I was working for my tribe as a cultural area wetlands coordinator. And what I learned there was what I realized was a lot of the Zuni reservation area is open to grazing land. At the time, 20 years ago, a number of sheep bands, at the time, there was about 60 bands of sheep. But throughout the years, it has dropped to about 40 bands. And to date, I imagine it's less than 20 bands. Even cattle herds dropped. Due to the ongoing drought, raising livestock is not economically feasible. But families hang on to livestock because the livestock, they help us meet our spiritual ceremonies. Obviously, livestock has been acculturated. I'd like to talk briefly about very fundamental on-the-ground efforts that my project has made in the past 2 years. In order to understand how dry the land is today. 30 years ago, I could get dryland corn seed to grow and mature without irrigating. Today, irrelated seed and its immediate surrounding soils need to be watered almost daily in order to see the corn mature. That's not the hard part. The hard part is finding water and hauling it in a pickup truck fitted with a water tank. In this period, 2 years ago, we raised 175 plants of a certain corn. It was a Zuni Hopi corn seed. During the pandemic, we got call. During the months May, June, and July, we were watering every other day, on average 300 gallons per week. And in August, we were watering every day, on average 600 gallons per week. I was hauling a 250-gallon water tank in my truck. And the freshwater springs where the villagers went to haul water was 15 miles out, 30 miles round trip. My truck averaged 15 miles per gallon of gas. Gas was at $3.18 per gallon. So a round trip, a single trip to haul water equated to $6.36 in fuel. So if you add these numbers up, it cost me close to $500 within that year to raise 175 plants. And this is not counting the hours of my work or the wear and tear on my truck. And so I think this gives you an idea why a lot of the farmers are giving up. And you can understand why it's not economically feasible. So, but anyway, it's kind of taboo to count plants, but we had to have a baseline record. The test plot was not intended as a food sustenance. However, the rain priest collected the corn pollen and took some full mature ears of corn to use as gifts for a cleansing ceremony. And we produced a seed for future use. So even though the plot was small, there was a lot of benefits that came out. We learned from it. In 2020, during the pandemic, the number of community gardeners increased, and so many gardeners competed for water. At the same springs located 15 miles out in the village called Pescado. We miss our river. The life of our river valley has suffered so much since its lifeline, the Zuni River, died some 50 years ago. It was a wake-up call when food became scarce. I was on a food drive, running to the supermarket at 5 o'clock in the mornings, but that's another story, and we'll come back to it. Now, here is a general overview of some of the work to demonstrate the resilience building that we did during the pandemic. In 2020, in March of 2020, just before the pandemic really hit hard, the first thing that came to mind was for the clan, for us to meet at our Central Village clan house and have a storytelling session to talk about previous scenarios similar to the COVID. And of course, what was that? We talked about a similar scenario, which was the smallpox that ravaged the US indigenous nations in the early 1900s. Along with the historical events, we talked about some of the stories, folktales that alluded to some of the sufferings and the migration of the peoples. And it was important to produce a script. And so we have a script as a record in our program files. The Storytelling Circle was a forum where the advisory team, clan, talked about what they were hearing in the community regarding the pandemic and were able to share their personal feelings. The process renewed our purpose organizationally, and as a clan, our commitment to community was strengthened. I guess to give you a little background about who we are and our land base. In fact, thank you for sharing the slides. That's the Zuni River from about 1879, 1880. And what you see on the screen is the Zuni River. At that time, the Zuni River in some parts was about a half mile wide. And in the foreground, you see those waffle gardens. Those were traditional waffle gardens that were tended to mostly by women. Today, you don't see anything like that slide. The river valley, the river corridor, it's overgrown with weeds. And thank you for sharing that slide. So to give you a little background, our project is poised in the background of a regional issue, but really the issue is a world problem. Our Zuni cultural landscape is mixed with the modern day demarcation of public and private jurisdictions we face today, though it doesn't matter to the COVID-19 pandemic nor the adverse weather patterns. To put it further in perspective, so the regional Zuni watersheds are altered and the hydraulic regimes are altered as well, the blood vessels of the earth severed. As the Zuni people, we were traumatized with the erosion of our watershed and just the disappearance of the river. When I say we were traumatized, there are things that we see based on these traumatizations. You can, I guess, call it PTSD. But when I talk about the traumatization of our people, the prophecy of the deerskin comes to mind, because we're at the point where brothers are starting to kill brothers. Now, where is our future? For one, we can't be complaining behind closed doors as a community, but rather begin articulating what we see on the ground and how we feel, reflect on our own life's experiences, and recall the teachings of the ancestors. We asked the people through a needs assessment survey, which was administered in 2020 under challenging circumstances. Obviously, dealing with the implementation of the needs assessment survey was hard because of the pandemic. But nonetheless, we were able to get about 25 community members that participate in the survey. Querying the People has also been through the art of storytelling, a medium to encourage reflection, venting, and sharing insights. On-the-ground tasks such as gardening, planting corn, and hauling water has been invaluable, and to a certain extent, understand the workings of our local government system. For example, in how it was addressing mental health conditions. And when I talk about mental health conditions, in the survey, we were looking at farmers and ranchers, but I think beyond the farmers and ranchers, there was really a serious problem that was invisible. To date, we're still following up on trying to compile information And if we do have the luxury of having a public forum, we'll be there to present what we learned based on our surveys and just informed observations. Our immediate environment is a river valley, the Zuni River Valley, but the river had died within the past 50 years. The river was a cultural and umbilical cord connecting cultural practices to land and water and air. The valley's water table has since dropped. Remnants of thick cottonwood bosques remind us of how once large populations of songbirds, waterfowl, and eagles that had lived among us. We were blessed. And I mean, we were truly blessed based on what we're learning now. Today, the hardiest dryland corn seed struggled to grow, and gardens and farmlands disappeared, leaving no hint for our children to decipher the true landscape. They cannot fathom that a river once flowed through the village. A cultural body of water lost is a fourth dimension lost, as waterways are our windows into the spirit world. When a person dies, they become part of that world. Interestingly, storytellers disappeared as did the stories when the river died. So it's a bigger dynamic. The vocabulary of water obligated plants and animal species diminished. Not very many elders can recite the cosmovision as the highest plains desert expands. The land is very thirsty. Since our culture is based on an agrarian philosophy, farming is front and central as is corn. So the absence of water can and has posed a serious problem, such as in maintaining our Aboriginal way of life and in meeting the food needs. There is a problem with food scarcity. We have become dependent on supermarkets. A demonstration site is being developed within our home office property. It has a freezer room with 3 industrial commercial-sized freezers, a greenhouse in the works, and a storage unit to house project equipment. The facility is an outcome of funding from 7th Generation Fund and the Native American Ag Fund. Their funding was very critical 2 years ago during the pandemic. We made our goal in 2020 to receive donated processed beef and to distribute it. This is an example of some of the work that came out in 2020. And again, the clan aunts, the clan brothers were really critical because they helped us bring in the meat, store the meat, and to help distribute it. So during that year, 2020, we had to build a freezer room and then purchase and install 3 industrial freezers. Everything came together on October 13, 2020, when the meat, a yield of 2,770.24 pounds, that's an equivalent of 6 steers, was delivered to our home office in Zuni, New Mexico by 2 representatives of the Buckner family ranch out of Colorado. The 2 men were received graciously by the Eagle Clan mothers. Celebration was over cooked tamales, lamb stew, and fresh earthen oven baked bread. Masks were mandatory. So the shipment was divided equally 3 ways. We sent 2 equivalent of 2 carcasses to Hopi, 2 to Navajo, and we kept 2. It was part of our food basket distribution to households in the Zuni village during the first wave of the coronavirus. To see and hear the loss of community members was sobering. Some of the deliveries went specifically to families of widows and widowers. An article about our food distribution experience during the 2020 pandemic was published by 7th Generation Fund. The publication came out in December 2020, and you can find the article on the 7th Generation site, the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples website. During the process, we also had to acknowledge the frontline workers. Food care packages went to local IHS frontline workers to acknowledge their service, for they were out there long hours working outdoors in the summer heat and being at high risk of exposure to the coronavirus. The care packages were tokens of appreciation. And in terms of connecting our work culturally, we got invited to critique a report. So why is it important for the project to critique the Zuni Resiliency and Adaptation Report? I think it was really critical because it was a public document for our people to see. Remember, during the pandemic, there were no public forums. So this was very critical. We got to voice our concerns. The invite told us our opinion matters and that there was a need for our cultural knowledge. It was about acknowledging accomplishments. A long time, it was a time for Indigenous peoples to get recognition for who they are and what they represent. Land stewards. As Indigenous peoples and community leaders, we have to be immersed in these complex conversations and advocate for our peoples. The time is now. Regarding my advisors, the leadership roles of the Eagle Clan elders is twofold: to carry on generations of cultural practice and to come forward in a circular sense to do outreach through grassroots education. Our tribe is an agrarian culture. Agricultural philosophy is interwoven into our daily lives and leadership. There is a fine line when it comes to implementing this foundation into the contemporary form of community leadership. That is why clan knowledge bearers, strategists, and implementers of pragmatic on-the-ground actions are very important so as to provide guidance to government leaders. It is not easy. In fact, the clans give the oath of office to elected officials. A constitutionally elected official is not legit until they get the oath of office from the rain priest, the traditional grassroots leaders. It has been contentious, though, at times. Self-serving minds resist, and that's what we're dealing with, I think, federally. On a positive note, the clan elders rallied together as pueblos in New Mexico. For example, in 2017, we rallied with other pueblos and we challenged the Sandoval County Commission, and our voices prevailed. However, sometimes our wins are short-lived. We struggle to protect Chaco Canyon from the gas and oil extraction to this day. The wins, they mattered for the moment, but the fight is always ongoing. In later October, the clan was formally invited in their grassroots capacity by the principal investigator of Zuni Cultural Resource Enterprise. And I mentioned earlier that we critiqued a resilience report. It was a lengthy report, but we focused in on evaluating and critiquing that report in December of, was it 2020 or 21? Anyway, so it's out there, it's posted, I think, on the Zuni website, and it was really worth our time because we have to interpret what is on the ground. We have to interpret what is in the river corridor. We have to say that we need access to our sacred sites. In fact, we need protections of trails leading to the sacred sites, because today, when you go to some of our sacred sites, there's cameras, there's other people, there's home built, and we don't have safe and easy access. And that's why this report was very critical. Oh, by the way, the report was entitled Zuni Resiliency and Adaptation to Extreme Weather Events and Environmental Trends. The Zuni Cultural Resources is a program under the auspices of the Zuni Tribal Administration. They were the ones that authored the report. We also implemented, as I mentioned earlier, a survey that benefited our goals and objectives as a project. The implementation of the needs assessment survey was administered to 25 plus community members and has provided firsthand information that tells us the need for change in our local policies and practices, and it includes federal policies. During that process, during that year, we met with federal agencies, and we're going to continue to work with them. But again, I guess this is why we really embrace the San Diego State University Forum, because again, we alone as local peoples in a reservation, our voice don't go far. We need partners like you. So again, thank you. So continuing, to follow our ancient cosmovision in a modern context is tricky and costly, meaning that it is not something we alone as Zuni can fix, because we are now dealing with modern day laws and jurisdictions and diverse peoples and diverse attitudes, good and bad. We are part of and dealing with the human race, the prophecy of ho'ipotikan, overpopulation, overtaxing the natural systems, overtaxing our waterways, the land base. So there has to be a conversation. The climate crisis and the pandemic knows no boundaries. We are all vulnerable and we are in it together. Our cultural world is in the hands of the international community because the outside decisions impact us the same on the reservation. In a divided country, we walk a fine line. What seems logical is to begin the conversation within our own community, within our own indigenous capacity. But the opportunity to do so is yet to come from the local government in the last decade. I'm sorry to say this, but we really critically need an open forum within our community, because there's so much to address, not just the water, but we have to think about the mental health conditions, especially post-pandemic. I hope it's post-pandemic. 100 years ago, our predecessors saw that the Little Colorado River and the Whispering Springs, our sacred site in Arizona, were dying. And they reported their observations in one of the sacred pilgrimages, excuse me. My Zuni tongue wants to take over. But anyway, the Zunis in about 1830s or 1930s, when they saw the ecological balance eroding away, they consulted the federal officials, but nothing happened. Eventually, one of our sacred springs, Whispering Springs, the most sacred springs in the Zuni Heaven area right along the Little Colorado River, disappeared. It's never coming back. So we know the pain. As indigenous peoples, we're not removed from the earth. We're part of the earth. We're part of the universe. And so when Mother Earth hurts, we hurt. It's painful. And again, that's why we look forward to these forums and continue to host these forums. There's a lot of work to be done. We are not just talking about farming, but farming is a way of life bound by our indigenous cosmovision. In the modern context, to address climate change is to address nation-state systems. There's jurisdictions. There's hardly any open doors. Even if we do get our foot in the door, nothing changes. In short, how do we cut to the chase, remove the red tape, as the saying goes, and minimize the potential for us to become climate refugees? We are in a dire position. A loss of a river says everything. So in conclusion, as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to appreciate our survival as a human race. The isolation due to the pandemic brought out nasty things, which I guess can be characterized as PTSD. But I also feel that good things came out. And unfortunately, bad things again, I don't want to get negative, but there were certain things that were forced out, and perhaps there were issues from long term, but anyway, it all came out. So in other words, it was a perfect storm where all things came crashing head on at a busy intersection. It was a nightmare and a wake-up call to humanity. Earth Mother is on a fragile equilibrium due to the impacts of man-made crisis. We don't know the total intricate workings of our planet and its precise place in the universe. What if her universal alignment, meaning her axis mundi, sways a degree one way or another? In other words, what if her north-south axis shifts? Would an explosion of a nuclear warhead create that shift in the already overtaxed system? It took millions of years to refine the natural laws that bring balance to our earthly home. Do we know her breaking point? Will Earth Mother and its natural laws deal with its own version of COVID-19? Will the human-made nuclear fallout on top of the climate crisis be that virus? Again, Earth is the only planet in our solar system that has a vast amount of pristine water. And beyond the solar system, there has yet to be any other planet discovered that has quantifiable and usable water. So why are we killing the water spirit? Water is a rare element in the universe as far as science can tell us. So I leave you with that thought, and we're here to answer any questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Word, for those powerful words. I'm sure plenty of people have comments and questions. Before we go there, we're going to go ahead and let Tino do his presentation, and then we'll talk about what you both have had to say. Tino, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. So I don't have a formal presentation. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking San Diego State University, as well as the Kumeyaay people, for allowing me to share the limited information that I have that is pertinent to a common dilemma. So I'll start with a little context. Swinomish Indian tribal community is a small reservation with roughly 1,000 tribal members. We reside at the bottom of the Skagit River. Those of you guys who aren't familiar with the Skagit River, we're the last river in the lower 48 with all 5 remaining wild salmon stocks. Tragic but true fact there. In addition to that, Swinomish is the only tribe, I guess I should say, we're signatories to the Treaty of Point Elliott. We're the only tribe that have gone through the Western governmental structure of acknowledging our connection to the entirety of the river, which is at nearly 150 miles upstream. Our concentration camp is at the bottom, but our homeland is the entire watershed and all of its tributaries. Another tragic but real fact that we have to go through, I guess, to lay claim to what, the few things that we've reserved. So in that, I'm going to transition to some of the things that Giorgio alluded to, the climate change crisis that we're all dealing with, the water manipulation that is just devastating to our homelands. I think one element of climate change that people quite often overlook is that it's making habitat more inhabitable for humans, which really throws off the balance of the natural world. So what we're seeing in our area is the urban wild interface encroaching further and further into the woods and taking away more of what we hold dear. So the things that we worship are a part of, like, as the powerful words by Edward said previously, we are a part of nature, not apart from nature. So those things are all being encroached on. Our life ways are at a point where we're at a fight for survival beyond what just an adaptation plan or something of that sort can fully illustrate. We're literally in a fight for our people's survival. And you know, that sounds a little bit extreme or maybe irrational, but that's really how we feel. And so, you know, I think it's, you know, the assimilation is ever present. I think one of my leaders said it best a few months ago in a meeting with the city of Seattle. He said, at one time when we were young, we would go to town and get something, fast food, something like that, and it was a rare occurrence. Now, our traditional foods, it is a rare occurrence that we're able to obtain those. So, and that's not from lack of trying. You know, it's an iterative process that has been a model of declining returns. So, combination of river manipulation, more extreme weather events, the things that all of us are seeing in terms of climate change, all of those things are happening in our watershed, and we're trying to do our best to adapt. But one of the casualties is that connection to our first foods, to our sacred places, to all of the things that make us who we are and what we are. You know, it's I think it was also said earlier in Giorgio's introduction, natural resources and cultural resources are one and the same. That we don't delineate, we don't separate those. You know, we have a nature-based worship, and in that worship comes the stewardship, and that's where some of that traditional ecological knowledge is, I believe, often disregarded. And I'll give you one example of that. Is one common thing about nature is it always has a way of cleansing itself. With colonialism and with the, you know, settler protection, you know, our main priority is to make sure our comforts are there, and that puts a direct roadblock in the way of nature cleansing itself. I'll give you a real brief example of that. We just recently had what we call in this area is a 100-year flood. 100-year flood throughout history comes around every 100 years. They're happening far more often than that, probably decadal average, something like that. But that 100-year flood was a combination of several events, including high tides and things like that. In a natural world, this would have been a wonderful thing in a lot of ways. It would have delivered nutrients throughout the region, throughout the floodplain, throughout the lowlands. But instead, we manipulated the system to protect the cities and everything, and we were able to hold back the water and protect all of the capitalistic properties in our watershed. And that was celebrated in the news. And in a quiet corner, it was a sad moment. So, and we did that through, we have a total of 4 hydroelectric dams on our river, 3 of which is what brought me in connection with Giorgio. And those are the Seattle City Light Dams. The city of Seattle derives 25 to 30% of their power from our river. Frustrating, but reality or real element of my life. Take the good with the bad. This is a moment of adaptation. The largest dam on the river is called the Ross Dam. They held back water during that high water event to the point where they were able to protect the lowlands. And protecting the lowlands, they also, like I said, do a disservice to nature. A service to the people, disservice to nature. This is a common occurrence throughout the globe. This is a global issue, not just in the Skagit. But beyond that, you know, like there's so many common themes throughout, whether we're talking about high desert, whether we're talking about plains, upper Midwest, all of Great Lakes, all of these problems facing tribal nations are so similar. You know, the isolation and the concentration camp that they put us on does not sustain us. And the changing environment, we don't have a choice. I should also point out that in addition to the watershed, we have a strong connection with the Salish Sea. And when you think about the Salish Sea climate change adaptation plans that we have to think of, you know, we're looking at sea level rise. We're looking at sea level rise having a devastating effect on a multitude of things that we hold dear and holy. We're looking at ocean acidification. How do we build a model of sustainability to the salmon and the shellfish that we depend on daily for not just our life, but our economy? Our economy is largely centric around salmon and shellfish. It was really strong salmon, really low priority shellfish. It's transitioned to the opposite. We are now very dependent on shellfish from an economic point, moderately to minimally dependent on salmon because of the decreased salmon runs. You heard earlier the wise words about the connection to water. We will say in every setting, everywhere, you know, water is the most sacred thing that we have. Protection of the water is of paramount importance. People have called us in the media greedy, that we're looking for the next gold, we're looking for control. It's exactly the opposite. We're looking for natural protection of what we hold holy. The water is where we come from. It's where we, you know, whether it's the freshwater or the saltwater, different religion, different practices, all of it comes into what makes us us. And all of it's under threat right now. You've probably heard a little bit, you know, through the grapevine of the southern resident killer whales and the plight they have. Many of those things in terms of climate change and things like that, everything is changing, which includes the distribution of fish. Where are they now? Where are they now? And then when I go back to the habitat manipulation and the more suitable habitat for humans, that's one of the major issues that we don't overly emphasize because it's an economic driver and a capitalistic positive in a lot of ways. The southern resident killer whales are sound hunters. You know, we look at them as relatives. We look at them as a part of us. Can you imagine trying to find your food in the middle of a freeway? That's what it's become in the Puget Sound. You know, the place has become so inhabitable and so desirable of a place to reside. People no longer vacation here, they reside here. So that inundation of human is a major threat, and it's changing everything about our ecosystem. So there's those elements. We're also an extremely rich, and I say that term very loosely, timber production area. We have several of the major timber companies have large holdings within Washington State. Timber production is a major driver of the Washington State economy. What the timber production and timber companies don't realize is that they've manipulated the natural forest and created a farm. You look at our hills, they look like a lush green forest. They're quite the opposite. There's no diversity. There's little to no resiliency. You know, we hope that we don't get hit by something like the pine beetle, but we're very susceptible to things like that. The environmental changes, the slow rise in temperature. One thing, you know, in my bio, it says I'm a wildlife program manager. One thing that's currently becoming a problem is we're getting diseases within our first foods, our deer and elk. Our deer experience a massive die-off on a disease that's largely in a drought-stricken area. thing, a hemorrhagic disease. These things are becoming occurrences that are far too common. Our elk are developing problems with their feet. They're getting a thing called hoof disease, and the hoof disease, if you think about it from a Western science perspective, that bacteria begins to grow at 42 degrees. Nature is not allowed to cleanse itself. You know, those are climate realities that maybe that the habitat is not as suitable as it once was because it's more suitable for bacteria. In addition to that, the bacterias are global now because of agriculture. Agriculture has moved, you know, like a liquid commodity throughout the United States. So a disease that may have resided largely, you know, in the Midwest or something like that on the large farms, or even in the Central Valley there on the large feedlots, are now, you know, ever present in our community. These are just absolutely high level occurrences that we're dealing with, you know, ocean acidification, things like that. How do we adapt and protect our shellfish? We're looking into, you know, a combination of both management as well as scientific adaptations, trying to look at predictors and see if we can't reduce harvest or accelerate harvest to mitigate for some of these things. You know, we're looking at crab all the way down to the larval level in our scientific programs. We're looking at salmon restoration is our number one focus. Restoration has been our number one focus for a lot of years, but restoration has its limitations. Some of the frustrations that Edward brought out are identical to the ones that we are experiencing up here in the Northwest. It's there's limitations on what we can do in terms of bringing things back to a balance where that these first foods can be obtained, where these first foods, you know, our traditional ways can be exercised. There's like I said, this is high level. I think one thing that if you look at throughout this region, we've been, and I say we're seldom, I shouldn't say usually, we're seldom alone. Our tribes band together on certain things, you know, and we become a very legitimate force. The water protection, we were able to obtain a state Supreme Court and a Ninth Circuit Court decision on protection of in-stream flows, things like that. Another thing that Edward touched on that is, like I said, a common theme is some of the state and federal agencies don't recognize the rights of tribes. It's a huge frustration. You know, my expertise is in wildlife. I would say that I'm largely on an island when it comes to what was promised. When I look back at history, it's a very blessed. We have a brutal but blessed history in the Northwest. We were signatories to treaties. Those treaties reserve rights to facilitate settlement. Those treaties were, I guess, they were a blessing and a curse. The curse is that the government intended to sign those treaties with the intent to eradicate us. The blessing is that our ancestors negotiated on behalf of us today, which is interesting because we're 7 generations down from that treaty signature to exist in perpetuity. So it's up to this generation to decide where the future goes from that. Giorgio, let me know if you want me to stop anywhere or continue on, or guide me in any way.
I think if you have more to say, Tino, please share it. I think perhaps if Edward has any questions, and I know some of the audience has provided questions, but something I think that's really important to consider is both Edward and Tino, you've talked about the centrality of the rivers and the previous effects that have occurred. We see with Zuni, this happened in the early 1900s. This was, Edward had discussed the flow of the Zuni River and how it's dissipated. This was purposeful governmental action on the Zuni River. And what you're talking about, Tino, with hydroelectric power is we see a lot of, there's a lot of interest in quote unquote renewable energies. And we know very often under this kind of broad umbrella framework of sustainability, there's three pillars: environment, economics, and people. And as we know in practice, as you and Edward have pointed to, it's very often economics that dominates, the religion of economics, we could say. And environment becomes a resource in the contemporary capitalistic sense of something to exploit. And people are sort of left aside, particularly as you both have talked about these previous historical geographical movements and how now with climate change, it's created increasing vulnerability around food security, these sorts of things. So I think on those fronts, I don't know if Tino and Edward, you might want to have some dialogue for people to understand kind of your shared sort of, relationships with that.
Yeah, no,
Sure.
Go ahead, Edward.
Sure. I just want to add to your latter comment about forced negotiations. I think in our earlier tribal leaderships, when there were negotiations for, like, for example, the Zuni watershed, I think it's presented in a subtle way. Of course, the government, the state, they would have an agenda, and our tribal leaders who are not privy to those kind of agendas or the economic drivers will innocently walk into a trap. And I know that you're saying certain things in a nice way. I mean, it could be more stronger, and I can relate to it. We have to be, I guess, politically savvy and watch what we say, but deep down, it really is painful to see things in certain perspectives where, again, like I would call forced negotiations. You walk in there, and once you go in there, I think you're trapped. I wish my leaders had understood that, but again, there was no conversations like we do, what we are having today. There's technology. Our community people are more educated in the, I guess, the academic processes, in the political dialogue, and so there's more of that articulated teachings than what our leaders had, and so we can't really be pointing fingers, but we're at the point where we have to pick up that burden and say, stop. There has to be that free, prior, and informed consent based on the United Nations declarations of the right of Indigenous peoples. So continue. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I couldn't agree more. I recently said in a meeting with the federal government that they are continuing the purposeful and intentional genocide that began 150 years ago. There is no misunderstanding there, and I agree 100%, Edward. I think beyond that sustainable energy element, and maybe even a larger issue and a more politically powerful issue, is agriculture. Agricultural manipulation has devastated our region. The dikes and ditches that have manipulated the water and taken the water and done what is beneficial to the economic side has had a long-standing impact. In addition to that, the strong ties to that valley soil, and when I say concentration camp, they moved my people to the end of a mud flat, disconnected from the mainland. That mud flat is now one of the most lucrative places for agriculture in the United States, but that was not the intent. make no mistake about it, they pushed us on what they believed would separate us from them. It's a brutal history that is continuously disregarded, and we are some of the blessed. I don't try to compare stories or try to act like my history is worse than somebody's, because I truly feel blessed to, like Edward say, still be at the table in the negotiation. It is a different world now, and it's time that we hold some of these agencies and governments accountable. You know, our strongholds are that we've never wavered from that natural resources connection. Those things, the hydroelectric project, you know, it's I don't know, we'll touch on it a little bit. I don't want to go too deep into it. There's a lot of, I don't know if you want to say grandstanding, but there's a lot of things going on that are largely, I don't know even what the correct word is, but there's a lot of things going on, negotiations within negotiations, I guess, or strategic negotiations that hopefully we can come out on the other side. And I shouldn't say in a better place, but with some recognition, because as Edward just talked about, when these hydroelectric projects went in, when these river manipulation went in, tribes were not consulted, even though we were fortunate and we actually solidified our connection to these natural resources. We were still disregarded. We were disregarded unilaterally across the region, across the state, and across the nation. That we were disregarded to the point to where states, as recently as this year in the Supreme Court and 1999 in the Supreme Court of Washington State, states have claimed abrogation of treaties upon statehood under an equal footing clause, which is a huge frustration. It all comes into that climate adaptation, though, and the climate change and the threat and the intentional genocide that was negotiated on behalf of settlement and things like that. And like, I'll stop there. I feel like I'm getting a little off track, but I'll stop there and thank you for the wise words, Edward. Like I said, I think we are eerily similar in some of our plights.
Well, we do have a question from the chat, and Selena, is that why you're raising your hand, to bring that to our attention?
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Okay, well, I'm gonna get to that in a moment. But I am just thrilled and also humbled to hear the words from both of you. I myself am not Indigenous. I'm at home today. I decided to come home instead of be in my messy office for this. But my house is on Payomkawitcham or Luiseño territory in northern San Diego County. And I've worked for a tribe for 17 years, and I do the work that you both are talking about as a TIPO and as the environmental director at Paula. And I see, Edward, I think your preliminary investigator or your principal investigator you were talking about, is that Kurt Dongoski? He's
Kurt
here.
Dongoski.
Yeah, he's here. And Tino, I've worked with or been fortunate to be able to be on panels with Larry Campbell and Jamie Donatuto from Swinomish as well. And listening to both of you, one of the things that really is resonating with me is this idea of the traditional practices that it seems like if they had been left to continue in the way that they should have prior to colonialism, perhaps we wouldn't be in the predicament that we're in right now. And that relates to the question from one of our audience members, where she asks, there is a lot of talk about integrating Indigenous practices and values with Western knowledge. Do you think this is possible on such a large scale, and what would it look like? I'd like to say yes, but we want to hear from you. Tino, do you want to take that first?
I'll defer to Edward first, and then I'll follow.
Okay. I think it's possible. You know, it's a small world, and in the recent history, we've learned how to communicate thanks to English, thanks to Spanish, thanks to Indigenous language revitalization. But before I get into that possibility of balancing science with cultural teachings, let me take a step back. I have to say that as Indigenous peoples, we have to look at language not in a superficial sense, because language is deep. Our Indigenous language can be translated. But to get to a higher level discussion, especially when we want to talk about our cosmology captures all aspects of our being, of our existence, and including the migrations that made this world, this cosmology. We have to say that we can't look at native language in a very superficial sense. We can't have an untrained individual translating. We have to have cultural practitioners that can delve into multiple layers of interpretation. And that's where I have a problem. Sometimes we have friends who are video producers, who are writers, but they capture our language, our thinking, our interpretations in a very precarious way. That doesn't help. And so we're at the point where we ourselves have to start defining, start reinterpreting our cosmology. And in my presentation, I talked about a spring, a sacred spring, whispered springs that once existed in the confluence of the Zuni River and the Colorado River in Arizona. It's not just a spring. It's a window to another world. And so that's why I refer to it as a fourth dimension. When you have a lake in the middle of a valley, the lake gives you an added dimension. It gives you another life, fish, shellfish, and wetland plants. And so there's that dynamic of dimensions. And people that are fluent in language, people that are very knowledgeable about this Indigenous cosmology, their tribal cosmology, can take you on a journey. And so that's why it's so critical to say that when the river died, storytelling died. When the river died, our conversations about wetland plants, our conversations about the leopard frog, for example, disappeared. Our children don't even know what a leopard frog looks like, when it was a common thing along the Zuni River. It was a common thing for us to see and live with. And so when we talk about science and our Indigenous values, there is an overlap. One example I use is that when we talk about the water cycle, water vapors rise, they go into the air and they come back to the earth, they're regenerate, they come back. And in fact, one of the common prayers that I learned from our late father was a prayer, which is essentially a water cycle. And so there's an overlap. And I think one thing that might help too is that as Indigenous peoples, when we talk about ceremonies, like for example, we make a pilgrimage every 4 years to Zuni Heaven in the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Zuni River in Arizona. It's a 4-day foot pilgrimage. In that ceremony, it's seen as a religious ceremony, a spiritual ceremony, but the activities that come out are defined as science, in my opinion, because in 1930, when that pilgrimage went to Zuni Heaven, they realized that there was an imbalance, there was degradation happening to that once ecological balance. And the reason why they know is that they take samples of cattails. They take samples of other wetland plants and water obligated species. And in science, what do we call those? Specimens. So our spirituality, our ceremony is not far removed from science. In fact, it is science. So it depends on how it's presented. So believing that scenario, I believe that science and cultural practices are speaking the same language, but in different dialect. Is that fair, Tino?
Wise words, Edward, wise words. I don't have as optimistic of an outlook. So can it happen? Yes. Would it be beneficial? But I think we have to be aware of, societal priorities and things like that really are major obstacles in my world when I negotiate at these tables. I've said many times that the cow should be at the top of that flagpole of the United States of America, not the eagle, because the eagle is a powerful, magnificent being that was disregarded to the point to nearly extinction, just to be clear about our history. Like that cow, however, has capitalized every aspect of nearly every negotiation. And I say cow using that as a broad term representation of agriculture, but one of the, I guess, elements of my skepticism is the fields. The natural resources field is probably, when you think about expertise and knowledge, one of the lowest regarded in our nation. You tell your child to be a CPA or a biologist, which one is going to be successful in this system set up in America? I myself have amassed a lot of material things and would walk away from all of them for the benefit of the greater good in a heartbeat. That is not common in America. That is not common in our society. I've actually begun the planning phases of how to distribute what I've amassed in this life, and we'll probably do it prior to my exit. Like, I don't hold these material things valuable. So as the general rank and file American, I don't see a ton of optimism of prioritizing natural balance or traditional ecological knowledge or a combination of Western and cultural sciences. I don't see them prioritizing it at this time. That's not to say that we're not going to have a massive wake-up call, because these weather events that are occurring more, like I said, 100-year floods are decadal. What happens when they're annual? Will we wake up? Things like that might prioritize, change society's priorities and make them more aware of what we've been saying is going to occur, will occur. When things like that happen, my optimism might grow, and hopefully there's a societal shift away from that laser focus on capitalistic gain to a more nature-based system of prioritization. Then I could see the welcoming of the cultural knowledge, and hopefully the system itself hasn't separated that cultural knowledge from the Indigenous people, because the Indigenous people, everything from forest manipulation, river manipulation, we're building a clam garden for first food resiliency. There's so many things that revitalization of old practices that really speak to climate change resiliency. I hope we can get to there. I don't have the optimism, though, with walking in this socio-political world that I'm immersed in on a daily basis. I think the answer probably lies in your generation of the person who asked the question. Will your generation recognize, because the past couple generations of American society have highly prioritized capitalistic gains. Nearly everybody I know looks at the Dow Jones every morning, looks at all of these things. I've never voted in I've never voted in an election other than tribal in my life. That tells you the priority I put on these things. But it's an interesting question. The optimist side of me likes to believe more what Edward says, and that there is a link. There's absolutely a link. I do not disagree with that in any way, shape, or form, but getting there is going to be the tough path. Thank you.
Yeah, that's I think you both were coming at the question from different angles, and of course that's a reflection of your personal experience, but I think it's also a good reflection of what other people are thinking. Yeah, Edward, looks like you want to add something.
I do. Tino alluded to a bigger place where we need to go. So I want to add by saying that even representatives of the our government know why the indigenous peoples are becoming invisible. And let me mention former CIA Director Michael Moran. Michael Moran, M-O-R-A-N. He was on one of the shows, and I saw this in 2012 or 2013. And I after he made a presentation, I made a note of it, so I keep a note of it. But he really made a profound comment, and it was during the war, and he was talking about the Sunni and the Shiites, and these were tribal peoples that were not ready to pick up arms, but because of that war, they picked up arms. And one thing that Michael Moran stated at the time, and unfortunately, I went back to try to see if I can record or find that site, but I wasn't able to because it was the Charlie Rose show, and you know what happened with Charlie Rose. And so that's why I couldn't find that footage, and that's my assumption. But in that show, in that interview, Michael Moran said, like the Shiites and the Sunni, it's the system that is failing them. It's the system that makes them invisible. And so now, with that point, come to my reservation as a Zuni, not a Sunni, but as a Zuni. That's what we're struggling with. And that's why we say, and in fact, that's what was said, that we don't want to be invisible anymore. There was that act that was introduced by our late Congressperson De Paula, and of course she took a different position, but back a couple of years ago, she introduced the act of we're not invisible anymore, and so essentially that's what the former CIA Director Michael Moran was saying, that the system is not going to work for small peoples because our vote is not big enough. And it's understandable, as pueblos in New Mexico, there's 19 pueblos in New Mexico. They're a group of the longest peoples that have been on this continent, but yet we are in little clumps of land base. The waterways, we don't even occupy much of the Rio Grande River that flows through central New Mexico. And so former CIA director really hit it on by saying that we don't make a difference because we don't have a large number. And so even though we might have the deepest roots, we're going to be clipped at ground level. And that's what's happening.
Looks like we do have another question. This one's not in the chat, it's in the Q&A box. So, but again, I can't help myself. I have to make a few remarks of my own. first. One of the things, Edward, that you said that resonated with me was the title of your, it sounds like your climate adaptation plan, where instead of climate change, it was called, extreme weather events and environmental trends. And, as part of the title. And the reason that I bring that up now is because you're talking about politics and votes and voices. And as an environmental director myself, I had to use the same language, and that was during the Trump administration, because you could not use the phrase climate change. So we found euphemistic ways to say climate change, and it turned into extreme weather and environmental trends, which has actually been in some ways problematic, just because it elides what it is we're really dealing with, which is climate change. Uh-oh, I triggered Giorgio because his hand's up. Go ahead, Giorgio.
I was just going to say, I was part of getting the grant and working on this study, and it was a BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs funded grant. And this was the exact language, just to provide more context for what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes, and so that both of our guests know, they've just released the new request for proposals for the BIA Climate Resilience Program, and there's a lot more money for it this year. I think there's $68 million. So think about doing a proposal, and they have money for implementation now, not just for planning. So, but the political aspect of things, I think, is a really key part of what we need to do when it comes to coming up with some solutions or some steps forward. Because when it comes to, for example, the hydropower that you were talking about, that Giorgio called quote sustainable. Well, it's not sustainable because it's destroying the watershed, and it's destroying all the non-human relatives that rely on that watershed. So it sounds to me like we have to go further, and instead of trying to come up with ways to maintain our current manner of living, the thing to do is to encourage people to live more in harmony. And I think both of you have been talking about that. And our question in the Q&A box is related to that. And it's in integrating Indigenous knowledge with Western science, what steps do we need to take to protect this knowledge from exploitation? If it's knowledge that is useful to helping all humanity tackle this existential question, it's also really, really deeply held and important information that shouldn't be misused. So, Edward, how do you respond to the protection of Indigenous knowledge?
Why is the 1%? When we talk about 1%, it's the 1% that controls the wealth, the world's money. And so looking at that, and then talking about democracy, there's a clash in my understanding. How can we have democracy when there's a 1% that's controlling the apron strings? And when it comes down to getting rid of dams, when it comes down to changing how we live, our behaviors, the 1% has the money, the financial resources to go against us, even when it comes down to dealing with voting. And so I think the primary thing is that how do we get the 1% to give back? That should be the focus in reversing this behavior about the pyramid scheme. And so we all want money. We all want money. However, the dollar is just a tool. When we start using dollar in other means to profit only the little, then it's that tool is being abused. And that's the 1%. The other thing too is that we have to look at, there has to be an organization that looks at the population. There is a lot to say about the population. As Indigenous peoples, we're at 3%, or just under 3%. At 13% is the Black population, and 16% is the white population. So I guess we'll be expecting 100,000 Ukrainians, the white Ukrainians, to come to the U.S. Is that? I mean, again, I'm just playing a devil's advocate. Is it because the 16% white population is threatened that there be people of color that will go beyond that population? Is that why the 100,000 Ukrainians are going to be brought in? I mean, again, I'm just playing a devil's advocate. So we have to look at the indigenous peoples of the land, 3%. How come they are kept at 3% and how come they haven't grown? When the Ukrainian president, when he fought to protect his homelands, he was considered a hero. Why is it that when indigenous peoples, let's look at Leonard Peltier, he fought to protect his people and he's in prison. When we as water protectors, we're out there, and here we go, when we're advocating for water rights, not as activists, because again, in government funds, when we say that we're an activist, it's not politically correct to identify yourself as an activist, but an advocate. So I'm just going back to your comment that it's a matter of semantics, but as indigenous peoples, as water protectors, when we fight to protect our waterways, then we're considered savages. We're considered less than human. It was only in 2007, October 13th of 2007, that the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples was passed. And then the world leaders recognized indigenous peoples as human. That's coming, again, I don't want to get into religion, but that's coming from the world leaders. And again, I don't want to get into religion, so I'll just stop there. So we have to, so in closing, I will have to say that if we really want to make a difference, we have to look at our world populations. Because if the rivers are disappearing, and for example, the Colorado River, which at one time was a mighty river, it still is. But if we see it dying because it's being overtaxed, then we have to say that what are the things associated to a dying river? It's overpopulations. I will stop there.
Yeah, and that makes me think, Tino, about what you were saying about the monoculture of the forests where you live now, where it looks lush and green for people who don't know any better, but it's really a cash crop that's being grown, right, for paper and lumber and all of those things. But you are very involved, obviously, in the bringing back some of these or protecting these original foods, these first foods. And I know from the work I've done with some of your colleagues and the tribal elders at Swinomish, that things like toxic algae blooms are dangerous, for if that gets into the shellfish, then the shellfish is no longer safe for human consumption. And yet that's indigenous knowledge that could be helpful for us in flight to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So how do we put those two things together, protecting indigenous knowledge, but also using it as a tool?
Yeah, no, and actually, when I turned my camera off, I attempted to go exactly where you're going. I tried to bring you guys to my freezer, and I was going to show you there is fruit preserves, there's elk meat, there's deer meat, there's crab, there's fish. There every single one of those main staple items. There's one commercially grown raspberry bag in my freezer. If I lost my Wi-Fi, otherwise I was going to bring you there. But that's one of the ways to get there, right? Is to have a connection with what you eat, right? Have a connection with what nature is and what this existence is, right? What sustains me. That's one of the things that the protection of water. Interesting you say that, right? The toxic algae bloom. My ancestors and even at my father's generation, they did not have Department of Health testing. However, nobody can ever remember having a PSP bloom or something like that, where that red tide, made a village sick, because usually we're feeding, far more than one. So we didn't have these threats that are now. But I don't know. I mean, it comes down to, protection of, and all of those, everything that I just mentioned all comes back to water. Every single one of them, whether it's deer, elk, bear, and then obviously the shellfish and the salmon, all of that comes back to water. Everything, be in touch with water, care about the water, and the one thing I would say is, and it might get larger, but unintended collateral damage, and this goes right back to, being more inhabitable, but the ecotourism industry is far more devastating than, they're well-intentioned generally as a demographic, but we're loving this place to death. Washington State is being overrun. Washington State, the population has doubled in the last 25 or 28 years. All of the natural places, all the sacred places, the ecotourism is booming, largely with non-consumptive type users who are generally environmentally savvy, but at the same time, just by sheer volume, they're devastating these ecosystems. So there's that element that I think bears mention. It's something we're trying to bring to both the state and federal agencies' attention, is that the place is being loved to death, and I'm sure you guys can relate. And in California, I don't think we're unique in that. And these common themes, can run deeper and deeper, and especially in our region where an area was inhabitable for, say, 7 months out of the year now, with the improving climate or rising of temperature and the snowpack being less and less annually, it's more like 9, 12, and then technology allows people to go further and deeper into the backcountry, have a larger human footprint. All of these things are playing a factor into how our natural resources are occurring.
Yeah, you mentioned California. You're right. What I'll say about Southern California is that we may not be as dry as some other parts of the Southwest, but there's to me, there's nothing more immoral than a golf course in the desert. And I don't like golf. I once dated a guy who golfed and he was terrible. So, now I just hate golf by default. But but you're right that there are people who mean well, and they think that they're loving nature by visiting it and saying they're communing with it, but they're having an impact on it that is outsized because there's overuse. But as we're drawing to a close here, we have about 10 minutes left. I know it's so important to talk about the reality of what we're facing, and that there's a lot of negative things going on, and we should not turn our backs on the reality of that. But I've worked in climate change for a long time, and I have found that when I feel at my lowest, somebody will come along and they will say, but look at all the good people out there doing the hard work. And especially for our young people who are listening to this, if you leave people feeling like there's no hope, then they kind of just throw up their hands and they say, well, then fine, I'm just gonna drive all the cars and I'm gonna leave trash on all the trails because it's hopeless. Everything's hopeless. Or for me, it's all about eating the Cheetos. And I was shamed 3 or 4 years ago by a Hopi woman who I said, I love Cheetos. And she said, Cheetos are an offense to the sacredness of corn. You shouldn't be eating Cheetos. And I was like, oh, shoot. Okay. I don't know if that's going to help because Cheetos are delicious. But the point is that we can find those moments of humor and we can find those moments of hope. And I think that we need that to be able to keep doing this work. So I'm hoping that both of you can give us some words of hope. But first, let me untrigger Giorgio with his hand up. Go ahead, Giorgio.
I just want to say really quickly, and it goes back to the opening statement. So, I assume, this is my assumption, that a lot of the audience are future climate scientists or future geographers or environmental scientists or whatever sort of disciplinary territorialization that you find yourself in. I think a couple of points that are fundamental with the wisdom and perspectives that Tino and Edward have shared is it's on each of us, and I'm including myself in this, to not be cowards. It's on each of us to work away from these epistemological errors that we're embedded in. That climate change, colonial and industrial-induced climate change, are demonstrating our errors. The way we understand, the way we engage, the way we live with and in the world. And a lot of these insights and wisdom that Tino and Edward have provided, it's on us to understand the lessons. It's on us to do the difficult work to come to know. And even if you're embedded in a Western perspective and value system, there's minor lines of Western thought and practice that have gone on for centuries that are far more in communion with what Tino and Edward have talked about. However, institutions like San Diego State, like Harvard, like Yale, like any of the universities, the UCs, whatever it may be, are some of the breeding grounds for perpetuating these epistemological errors, these value systems, these ideas that economics is what rules, or that the field is a laboratory. What Edward was talking about with the cattails revealing themselves, that was the environment revealing itself. That was not treating the land as a laboratory itself, as something you do violence to and artificially create these artificial boundaries as if it's a lab where you're picking things apart to understand their functions. So this is on all of us. This is our responsibility. We are the ones embedded in these practices and these worldviews. And so if we want to change and do things differently, it's on us to take this wisdom up and do the hard work to better understand it and better respect it. So that I just want to kind of provide that context and turn it over to Edward and Tino.
Yeah, so to recap, hope.
I would say hope is hollow without practice. That's all.
Okay, all right. You can lower your hand now, Dr. Curti. No, and I agree with. I do agree. It is our responsibility, but sometimes people just need that little. They need that little push. They need to feel like what they're doing is that it matters, especially when you're young and you look at people my age who are your parents' age and think, why didn't you do something? I knew about this when I was in high school, 30 years ago. How come you didn't do something? So, Edward, please.
I think what I feel has been really beneficial for us, especially the last 2 years when we were not allowed to be out and about, it was really important to find partners that could carry on the dialogue. And for me, by the way, I just had another advisor join us halfway through our meeting, and so I have 3 advisors with me in this room, and that's what I want to talk about. I think it's building a circle within a community, a circle that have the courage, as Giorgio has mentioned. It's uncomfortable to take the lead, but when you see people that meet you and greet you and express their appreciation, it says a lot. It's a simple conversation of gratitude within 2 individuals in this day and age, in this time. It makes a world of a difference. One of the, I guess, the critical points for us as leaders has been living with the pain of seeing the erosion, not only to the language, but how the practices are being undermined, shortcuts are taken, And even some of our leaders that want to be in that position, but are not willing to do the homework. You know, whether you're an academic or whether you're a grassroots leader, you have to do your homework. You have to want to communicate, and storytelling has really been a very positive genre. Storytelling took us on stage, storytelling here and there. And so really it's a good teaching tool, but it also, if you want to evaluate self, we're talking about self. If you want to evaluate self, do storytelling. Storytelling tests you. When you're on stage, you make yourself vulnerable. People are going to say things, and are you going to take that? Are you going to fight it? No, you just find ways to say, okay, you're critical of my work. Join me on stage. Can you teach me a better approach in telling the stories that I'm putting on stage? And so these are examples about really doing self-evaluation, and again, growing with your circle, growing with your advisors. And when I say growing with your advisors, I'm not leading them. They're there with their sleeves rolled up. For example, we're finishing our greenhouse. It's going to be an aquaponics unit. My culture advisor sitting behind me, he's been helping me with carpentry. We have 1,000-gallon tank in there. It's filled with water. We're ready to buy fish. And so it's not about one person higher than the other, but to work in unison to make things happen. And so there's a saying, and I hope I can say it right, because it's the cultural practitioners phrase that was coined. It's a cultural coined phrase, and it says the one who sees ahead. It's an official role, and it's practiced within the culture. And so in our co-presentations, my culture advisor and I, in our co-presentations, one of our presentations was called Like Water, we'll create our own path. And in that session, that's what we honed in on. What does that mean in a cultural sense? But what does it mean from an ancestor's perspective? The one who sees ahead. And so in the work that we're doing, it's becoming very clear. When the pandemic hit, before the world shut down, or at least the United States shut down on March 16th, we had our storytelling on March 13th. That was on a Friday, a few days before the whole continent shut down. But in the storytelling, that's what we talked about. What is it that you see out there? How do you infer what's being said? Are people afraid? And so on. So we have to go back to that level of relying on our cosmology, our cultural teachings, the definitions. And again, it's not about just translating a word. It's about interpreting our lived experience. And so my hope for the young people, my hope for our circle of dialogue is that we need to share our stories, and let's really evaluate the stories, because the old stories, they're not old, they're new stories. We just need to undust them a little and bring them back to life, but the answers are there. And so we can't give up on ourselves, and we can't put pressure on our children. We can't tell our children that you need to do this, this needs to come from you. We have to be meeting them halfway. And I made a little note here, and I think I turned the page, but there was a point about the system, and I think it came from Tino. If we're going to change the system, it has to be the coming generation. It has to be the next generation that is willing, that whom will have the courage to say that let's take over the system, and let's not reinforce or affirm a system that hasn't worked, but create a new system where individuals that are protecting Mother Earth are not considered savages. We need to equal the playing field. That's where the system needs to go. And I believe in the young generation. I believe in Corey. I believe in Selena. Giorgio, who is a young man. I believe that these forums and these conversations and these people willing to take the leadership along with other diverse leaders, that's where we need to go. Gandhi was courageous. Thich was courageous. And I imagine often they were alone. We find ourselves alone many of the times, but that's when the best thinking happens. So being forced into isolation is not bad. I say that because I'm an introvert, so that might not be fair. But anyway, my hope is the young generation, the upcoming generations, but we have to be there with them. We have to leave something behind, not just the legacy of our work, but what is it that we can write? Let's redefine our cosmology that talks about human as part of the equation of the natural world, not separate, not superior. That's where I think the hope is.
Thank you. Those are good words and give me hope. And Tino, do you have any final thoughts before I turn it back to Corey to close this out?
Yeah. Thank you everybody for staying over a little bit, but I do have some, and I do appreciate your redirect or direction to concentrate on hope and to give something back. And as I walk through life, I'm always attempting to learn, and I'm going to leave with the hope that I leave this seminar with. It starts out with Giorgio's land acknowledgement and the executive order that Biden brought down. And that goes back to the previous comment of how do you get involved. The consultation policy will integrate traditional ecological knowledge. Now, it comes back down to another comment made by Giorgio about the institution is the disease. The institution of Harvard, Yale, San Diego State, Washington State is also the cure. You are the future. You are going to be the leaders coming into the next world. You are the ones who can right the systemic wrongs. I said before that we weren't consulted in 1930 when these dams went into our river. If you are in a professional world, whether you're an engineer, a scientist, or a politician, if you integrate tribal knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge in a planning phase versus an implementation phase, you have the potential to literally change this world for the better. Like, this traditional ecological knowledge is often, nature-centric. My entire existence has been nature-centric. Like I said, it goes to the foods, everything. All of those things are positives. And you being the future are the only ones who can change that, right? There's so many things that at this point in life where I get closer to knowing more on the other side than this side. As that progresses, my effectiveness needs delegation. I spent the first 3/4 of my life or more listening and be seen but not heard. All we were taught to do is listen. I'm just becoming to a point in life where I can speak. So it's interesting, but that knowledge has to be absorbed and professed by you as a younger generation. The professionals that come through, your generation might be the most important generation in the history of this globe, not just the United States. Like, the things and the actions that you take and the priorities that you guys make as individuals, and the things that you've learned in those institutions. Like I said, the institution is the cure. Globally, we're set up in an academic world. We rely heavily on those academics for guidance, expert witnesses, expert direction. All of those things come out of academia. So do not discount what the task at hand is and take it and have the difficult conversations. Often, you know, if we only concentrate on what's easy, it'll likely repeat history, right? The hidden history of America is undeniable. It's unspoken. Nobody talks about what happened. To this day, they don't talk about where, you know, the displacement of my direct relatives. I'm talking about my grandmother. It's still not spoken. So have those difficult conversations, come to grips with it, and change the world, because it is literally in your hands. It often sounds cliche-ish and things like that, but it's not a cliche. It's a reality. And I 100% agree with Giorgio that the disease is there, but the cure is there as well. And like I said, and they're one and the same. So it's up to us. It's up to you guys. I appreciate you guys lending me an ear. I'm honored and humbled that to sit on a panel with Edward. I'm honored and humbled to be asked by Giorgio. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. And Corey, you want to close us out?
Yes. First, I just want to say we are honored, truly honored to have Edward and Tino here tonight. So thank you both again for taking your time to be here and share your knowledge, share your stories. And I hope that everyone is challenged. I hope we sit with this information that we've heard tonight. And I hope that we ultimately act upon what we've been taught here, what we've heard through the stories, through the histories, through the knowledge. I know as a climate scientist, I myself am challenged. And I hope that this is a first step. These forums, these panels are kind of a first step to really engage and challenge our ways of thinking in terms of climate science, climate change, and even modeling itself. So we also want to thank Shasta for being here tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow night and Thursday, and Giorgio as well for taking your time to moderate. And we want to thank our attendees for logging in and staying with us and staying a little bit over. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but again, we will follow up with the recordings through a post-event newsletter. We will also post the recordings on our main webpage. So we hope everyone has a good and safe rest of their night, and we hope to see you in day 2 tomorrow. So have a good night.